Welcome back to Fairy Tales. You know it by this side, but I want to start from this side this time. So we're going to go to the next story, which is Cinderella. Once upon a time, there was a lovely little girl named Cinderella. Her mother died when she was a baby, and she was raised by her father, a kind and gentle noble man, and her nasty stepmother. Cinderella's father treated her like a princess. Every night he'd tell her the same bedtime story of a beautiful girl named Cinderella who grew up, fell in love with a handsome prince, and lived happily ever after. Cinderella's stepmother had two daughters of her own, Olivia and Ingrid. She was jealous of Cinderella's relationship with her father and didn't like that Cinderella was gentler and sweeter than her two lazy, grumpy children. In front of her husband, Cinderella's stepmother was always kind, but when he wasn't around, she yelled at Cinderella all the time. Cinderella adored her father so much that she could not bear to tell him how terrible her new stepmother treated her. The years passed, and Cinderella did her best to stay out of her stepmother's way. One day, while Cinderella splashed around in the pond behind their villa, her nasty stepsister Olivia came and stood by the shore. "Oh, brat," Olivia called out. "Mother wants to see you right away." Reluctantly, Cinderella dried off and went inside to find her stepmother lying in bed. "Come here," commanded her stepmother. "I have some bad news," she went on. "Your father had a riding accident on the way home from his trip and was killed." Cinderella was stunned. She felt her knees go weak, and she crumpled to the floor. "How could this be?" she thought to herself. "How could there ever be a world without my father?" Lonely and heartbroken, she cried herself to sleep that night and for many nights thereafter. Cinderella spent the rest of her childhood living like a servant in her own home. Her stepmother took away all her fine dresses and jewelry, and Cinderella was forced to wear rags and work as a maid to her stepsisters. When Cinderella was 16, the king announced that he would host a great ball to find a bride for his son, the prince. Invitations went out to all the well-to-do unwed maidens in the kingdom. A royal messenger arrived with 3 invitations for Olivia, Ingrid, and Cinderella. Cinderella's stepmother quickly ripped up the envelope addressed to Cinderella, however, and threw it into the fire. "Maids do not go to balls," she laughed. Cinderella spent the next day running around sewing her sister's ball gowns, washing their hair, applying their makeup, and helping them get ready for the party. As she waved goodbye to their carriage, she sighed to herself, "Oh, how I wish I could have gone too." "What's with the sad-faced child?" chimed a voice behind her. The young maiden turned around and saw before her a plump old woman with apple cheeks, and wore the most kindly smile. She wore a long, shimmery dress and held a sparkling wand. "Who are you?" gasped Cinderella. "Well, your fairy godmother, of course," exclaimed the cheerful old woman. "I've come to help you get ready for your big debut." "What are you talking about?" asked Cinderella. "Don't you want to go to that ball?" "Of course, but I have nothing to wear to such a glamorous party. Look at me," wailed Cinderella. Said the fairy godmother. "We'll just have to take care of that." With a flourish of her wand, Cinderella's rag dress turned into a white diamond-studded ball gown. Cinderella's diamond pins holding up the ringlets in her hair, and wore delicate glass slippers on her feet. Even her fingernails were smooth and polished. She looks like a princess. Oh, how beautiful, cried Cinderella. But how will I get to the ball? Fetch me the largest pumpkin in your garden, answered her fairy godmother. Cinderella ran to their yard and brought back a huge pumpkin. The fairy waved her wand, and with a poof, the pumpkin turned into a glittering coach of pure gold. Now check the mousetrap and bring me as many mice as you can find, instructed her fairy godmother. When Cinderella brought back 6 field mice, the old woman twirled her wand again and turned them into 6 footmen, wearing fine velvet uniforms. Finally, the fairy grabbed up a rat and turned him into a driver for the golden carriage. As Cinderella mounted the coach, her fairy godmother warned her sternly, "You must be home by midnight, for the spell will only last till then. After that, your carriage will turn back into a pumpkin, your footman into a mice, and your gown into tattered rags." When Cinderella arrived at the ball, nobody recognized her, not even her 2 stepsisters. The prince had danced with every maiden at the party and complained to his father that there was no one worthy of being his bride. "Heavens to Bestie!" exclaimed the king. "There are hundreds of beautiful ladies here tonight. You are just being too picky." Just then the king noticed Cinderella standing by herself. "Look there, how about that lovely young lady?" The prince followed his father's gaze and was love-struck at the first sight of Cinderella. "Perhaps you're right, father," he mumbled as he made his way across the palace hall. He approached Cinderella, bowed gratefully, and asked, "My lady, may I have this dance?" Cinderella blushed and answered with a curtsy, "I would be delighted, my lord." The prince led her to the center of the floor, and as the orchestra struck up a waltz, they began dancing. For the rest of the evening, they danced and talked and laughed together. "Who is that girl?" Olivia asked her sister with great irritation. "I've never seen her before. She must be from another kingdom," replied Ingrid. "Well, I wished she'd climb back under whatever rock she came out from," Olivia pouted. She and the prince shared their 10th dance. Cinderella listened in horror as the clock tower began striking midnight. Without thinking, she turned and ran from the palace. The prince called out to her, "Please, you never told me your name," but Cinderella was already gone. As she raced down the castle steps, she lost one of her glass slippers. She leaped into her waiting coach and reached home just before her carriage turned back into a pumpkin, her footmen into mice, and her gown into tattered rags. The next day, the prince went out with his courtier to try the single glass shoe on the foot of every maiden in the kingdom. Whoever fit the slipper would have to be the young woman who had so dazzled him the night before. When the prince and his courtier arrived at their home, both Olivia and Ingrid tried to shove their big feet into the small glass slipper. Then Cinderella stepped forward and asked shyly, "May I try on the slipper?" "Don't be silly," spat her stepmother. "You're just a servant girl. How could the slipper possibly belong to you?" "It wouldn't do any harm to let the girl try," said the courtier kindly. So Cinderella sat down and slipped the glass shoe onto her delicate foot. "It's a perfect fit," said the courtier, and he announced that Cinderella must be the prince's mystery maiden. "That is most impossible," screamed her stepmother. The prince reached over and took Cinderella by the hands, staring into her deep blue eyes. He recognized her as his true love and asked tenderly, "Will you marry me?" She paused for a second before answering, "Yes." And the prince embraced her in a gentle kiss. So the prince and Cinderella were married in a beautiful ceremony at the royal cathedral. Her evil stepmother and sisters were not invited, just as her father had foretold, and lived happily ever after. Thanks, guys, so much for joining me for Cinderella. I'll see you next time for Goldilocks and the Three Bears.